The Final Fantasy series has evolved greatly since the original game in 1987. We've seen many small and dramatic changes, from traditional turn-based combat to the active time battle system to action combat and various iterations of all systems. Evolution is important to the development philosophy of Final Fantasy. However, one of the biggest debates between Final Fantasy fans has been if the MMORPGs, FF11 and FF14, count as part of the main series. I certainly think they count. They have stories, final bosses, endings, and plenty of familiar elements to justify their relevance. I would even go on to say they are like modern-day equivalents of FF1 and FF3. Sadly, FF14 version 1.0 is no longer playable, but A Realm Reborn is a powerful replacement, bringing a new story, but also respecting the legacy of its predecessor. It's a real shame to see so many people try to discard this game from mainline canon, because others on the contrary have claimed Final Fantasy XIV to have the best story in the entire series. To know how the story begins, you must first know about the Battle of Carteneau, the pinnacle event of Legacy FF14. Nail Van Darnus of the Garlean Empire is the original game's villain. She's a commander who has more malevolent intentions than even the Emperor, and decides to summon a meteor to destroy Eorzea against his wishes. The Warriors of Light are able to defeat her, but sadly are not able to stop Meteor and save the realm, even though it is not fully destroyed. What I think is interesting is that the Meteor is actually a cocooned primal Bahamut. This is where the heart of this event resonates most with me. As you hear Nobuo Uematsu's beautiful track Answers, you have to see the people staring at the sky, knowing their last living moments have caught up with them. And I really felt that. The powerful sage named Louisoix tries desperately to protect the people from the flares of the primal, but ultimately fails to change the fate of Eorzea, leaving many dead and survivors left with practically nothing. Nail Van Darnus' sick obsession with the Lesser Moon Dalamud has led to the destruction of the entire realm. To Legacy players, this was the end of Final Fantasy XIV. Tragic, but resonating. To A Realm Reborn players, this serves as the lore for the new story, similar to the Nibelheim incident in Final Fantasy VII. Both are vitally important and are heavily referenced throughout each respective game. 5 years have passed, and the 7th Umbral era has begun. The people will always remember the legendary Warriors of Light who defeated Nail Van Darnus, but I've also come to a realization that those days are long gone, that lightning can't strike in the same place twice. But the crystal calls again, calls for a new era of adventurers to save Eorzea from an upcoming threat. This is how you start a Final Fantasy game. So classic. Just like its MMORPG older brother, and the original Final Fantasy, you as the player gets to create the Warrior of Light from the ground up. Even though you get to decide its race, gender, and customized physical traits, I think the best part is choosing your initial job class. First time I went through the game as a Lancer/Dragoon, so this time I wanted to switch things up and go with a tank role. I like how the game begins with a dream sequence. The crystal is calling for you as the Warrior of Light to hear, feel, and think, but is then interrupted with a sinister presence, ultimately leading to a geared up version of your character going head to head in battle with this dark force. Already things are interesting, and you're wondering the significance of your dream. Depending on which job class you chose, you'll be dropped into one of these starting cities, Gridania, Limsa-Lominsa, or Ul'dah. First thing you'll notice is how beautiful the world is in Final Fantasy XIV. The color palettes used are so vibrant, and the landscapes are all so diverse that it keeps your interest as you progress through your adventure. You start out to the rest of the world as just another plain old adventurer, and are set out to do meaningless tasks. But for some reason you keep encountering the dark presence from your dream, as if this force sees something in you that no one else does. I really love how effectively the lore is presented. You're able to see how much the Battle of Carteneau has affected the commoners and leaders, which makes the eventual revelation of you as a new hope and a warrior of light work so well. The battle mechanics are streamlined and fast-paced. If you've never played an MMORPG before, you'll probably relate it with Final Fantasy XII. You're constantly learning new abilities and tactics that make the gameplay more and more strategic the further you progress. You can become an expert at direct damage output, defensive strategies, or healing and protection. Whatever job you choose though, you get a nice throwback to FF1's job upgrade about halfway through the story. That is one of many incentives to keep powering up your character. I try to fight as many enemies as possible solely to enjoy the sleek monster design. This is something I pay attention to when I play a Final Fantasy game, and FF14 does not disappoint at all. I love all the designs for the primals, story bosses, and most of the regular enemies. I have to mention key creatures of tradition within the FF universe, like Marlborough, Behemoth, and my favorite, Iron Giant. I like how it's shaped more like a human, and it's used as a top-line defense machine in the Garlean Empire. Oh yeah, check out the Cactuar, pretty different, right? There are tons of interesting personalities to meet in the game. The important story characters are all memorable: Minfilia, Papalymo, Ida, Alfinad, Y'shtola, and all have interesting backstories explored in the Legacy version. Biggs and Wedge are pretty hilarious in this, and Thancred, who is a charming protector and a genuine friend. My favorite character is Cid, who of course is a master engineer and plays a major role in the story. For much of the game, his whereabouts are a mystery, and he goes into hiding because he's labeled a traitor by the Garlean Empire. My favorite parts of the game all revolve around him, and his journey to reclaim his airship. You know, come to think of it, he reminds me a lot of Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars Episode 4. Anyway, back to the characters in the game. There's a lot of weird names you'll have trouble pronouncing, which adds to the charm of the world. Foofaloopa? I want to name a kid after that. The villains are quite effective. The armored knights in the Garlean Empire always ignite a threatening presence. The new leader of these, Gaius Van Balsar, has a sweet design, and I love the voice work. Reminds me a lot of Shredder from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon I watched as a kid. This is one of my favorite scenes, where Nero has to take care of some insubordination. I always find myself comparing these villains to the judges from Final Fantasy XII, or even Golbez and Exdeath, and I love every scene they're in. Gaius was around for the Legacy events and has some unfinished business. His new plan and war machine is none other than the Ultima weapon, and has such an intimidating aura. The most epic part of the game involves this thing, and I'll talk more about it later. With all that said, I think FF14 is worth playing alone for the villain content. I think the music is quite good in FF14. Version 1.0 was the last soundtrack fully composed by Nobuo Uematsu since Final Fantasy IX, so it deserves some listening to. The before-mentioned track, Answers, is the defining anthem of the game. It is a pleasant reminder that Final Fantasy XIV is much more than just an MMORPG, that its compelling narrative can hit just as hard as any of the other great stories you love in the series. While most tracks represent adventure and the beauty of Eorzea, Answers packs the emotional punch most look for in Final Fantasy. Let's not discount the adventurous tracks though. It is so important to note how beautifully lighthearted this game can be, and most of the soundtrack truly hit home. There is a lot of side content in Final Fantasy XIV. It being an MMO is a given already, but with constant patches and updates happening all the time. First off, you definitely want to unlock chocobos, which also gives you access to mounts in general. These will help you traverse the lands much quicker. Some of these can be pretty quirky, and a lot of fun to see how many you can collect. Speaking of, I love that Final Fantasy XIV has a charming silliness to it that I feel has been missing from the series for quite a while. You can get involved in player versus player fights, optional dungeons, and even a gold saucer taken straight from FF7. The gold saucer is a ton of fun, lots of mini-games and festive FF nature, even triple triad. The optional dungeons are stellar. Lots of them are direct recreations of older Final Fantasy settings, such as the Crystal Tower, Labyrinth of the Ancients, and World of Darkness from FF3. There are several unique and classic FF bosses to fight, including Chaos, the Cloud of Darkness, X-Death, and even Kefka. Final Fantasy XIV is so good at making me want to revisit older games. The main superboss from Aurel Reborn's initial launch was the legendary Twin Tania of the Binding Coil. Other notable bosses that appeared later were Nel Deus Darnus, a recreation of 1.0's final boss, and the dreaded Primal Bahamut. As of the time of this video, there have been 2 expansions released, Heavensward and Stormblood, and another that was recently announced, Shadowbringers. I'm counting these as sequels since there is so much story and content to cover, so I'll make separate videos in the future to cover these. I must say this though, I am stoked for Shadowbringers. My 2 favorite job classes in Final Fantasy are the Dark Knight and the Blue Mage. The expansion is themed around the Dark Knight, and the Blue Mage has been announced as a new job class for it. There is so much great content offered in the FF14 universe, so it really is a shame that many refuse to play it. I think it's mainly because of the multiplayer aspect, but honestly only about 10% of the game is multiplayer, and now that the Trust system has been announced, you'll be able to play all of the game's content single player, with AI party members. Oh, also, if you haven't yet, you should check out Dad of Light on Netflix. It's a touching story about a father and son that uses Final Fantasy XIV as a tool to tell its story. It's worth checking out. After getting the attention of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, a Louisoix discipleship group trying to stop the primal threat of the realm, they recruit you to help in their efforts to fight Ifrit. It's kind of funny actually. After you defeat Ifrit, Eorzea treats you like some kind of superhero. The Scions keep talking about how much you remind them of the Warriors of Light and become more and more convinced of your calling from the crystal each time you defeat a new primal. The Grand Company leaders are all fighting for you to join their cause, so you get to hear countless locker room speeches. Seriously, this game has tons of them. What the Scions see in you is the power of the Echo, in which the crystal communicates with you and allows you to see into others' souls and pasts. My favorite aspect is to be able to see the leaders' accounts of the Battle of Carteneau. The price of war is truly made manifest, and it makes me feel even more emotionally connected with the citizens of the world. Not often do we get to directly deal with the people after major catastrophic events take place, and I think this is where the story of Final Fantasy XIV is most effective. I can truly see why so many claim FF14 to have the best story. I would encourage reading as much as you can about the lore. It really sucks that version 1.x is no longer playable, because I think its material is incredibly interesting. To learn more about it, I would suggest reading the Encyclopedia Eorzea, or even summaries online. Maybe the crystal's call to hear, feel, and think is for both the warrior and the player. The more primals and boss fights you encounter, the more confident you feel in each battle. Most of these fights are quite memorable, and there are different strategies required for each. There's a pretty creepy moment at a ship graveyard where Siren is essentially summoning the dead from the sea to attack you, and I love that Final Fantasy V reference. The dungeons are so unique too. One is set inside a haunted house where you fight a succubus at the end, and another tropical forest with a poison-resistant dragon that you have to lure out of its biobaths to damage it properly. My favorite story dungeon, excluding the final ones, is the Stone Vigil located in the frozen lands of Korthus. The vigil is filled with ice elemental dragons, and you'll need to be very careful to avoid the boss's blizzard traps. I think FF14 probably has the best set of boss battles in the series, especially coming from a strategic and creative standpoint. Speaking of boss battles, I absolutely cannot go without mentioning the most epic moment of Final Fantasy XIV. Each game has the scene that defines it, and this one goes to the battle with the primal Garuda, and I think anyone would agree. Sadly, Garuda's intimidation is short-lived. After the fight, Gaius appears with the Ultima weapon to show off its power, and it actually consumes all three story primals, Ifrit, Titan, and Garuda, and gains all their powers. This is insane. As crazy as this isn't the only threat to Eorzea. Ultimately, it's a supernatural parasite called the Ascians that are driving the Garlean Empire to take over. La Habrea, who the player has encountered in dreams, sadly turns out to be using the Scion Thancred as its host, driving even more conflict into the mix. Now is the time to prove you are the new hope of the world. It's time to prove what the Scions have come to believe. You are the new warrior of light. The Praetorium is this game's final dungeon, and it is the Magitech castle holding the Empire's Ultima weapon. I think its design is solid. Many final dungeons take a supernatural approach. This one is simple, but effective. Most of the enemies are Magitech soldiers and machines, but along with the top-notch theme song and aesthetic, it feels right. Can't, I mean shouldn't, have a FF final dungeon without several big boss battles, and this one doesn't disappoint. Thank goodness Square patched this dungeon so you can't skip cutscenes. When I originally played through the game, I had to skip every cutscene just to keep up with the rest of the party and enjoy the boss battles. But once the trust system is implemented, I'm definitely going back to this dungeon to explore and savor the experience more. This theme song though, I think it may be my favorite final dungeon theme of the 3D era.
Now open your eyes. adventure is taken.
I love the emotion felt in every FF game where you're coming so close to the final boss, and you think back on the long journey that brought you to this moment. Every story cutscene, and the relationships you've developed with the characters in the story. Alright, it's time. The final gauntlet. Gaius, the ultimate weapon, and La Habrea. I think it's so interesting that the game's plot mirrors the current state of the series. Many people see the franchise as having died after the PS1 era. The citizens of Eorzea have felt that the time of the Warriors of Light have passed after the Battle of Carteneau, and that there's no more hope for them. I strongly disagree with both. Look to those who walked before to lead those who walk after. Just as the new Warrior of Light has brought renewed peace to the people of Eorzea, Final Fantasy XIV is compelling proof of greatness still existing in the series. I don't believe that any of the mainline FF games are bad. I only see strengths that each brings to the table. I still believe in Final Fantasy. And as I look around me in the game's world, I know that I'm not alone. That all these people are playing the game because Final Fantasy has touched their lives in some way. There are millions of people that love this game, and it is a symbol I stand behind when making my arguments on the series' behalf. I love the story, I love the music, I love the villains and boss battles. I love acting stupid with my friends. And you know what's awesome? The story doesn't end here. The Warriors of Light are just getting started. There is still some great content that bridges the gap between this and Heavensward, including fights against Leviathan, Rama, and Shiva. Remember the days in older FF games when you would name the characters after you and your friends, imagining you guys going on adventures together? This is that experience made literal, and it is truly special. Final Fantasy XIV is wonderful. The Warriors of Light, the Crystals, and pure fantasy are back. Does it count as a mainline entry? Heck yes it does, and with flying colors if you ask me. If you were to tell me any specific aspect you love about Final Fantasy, I would bet you'd find it in this game. It is worthy of your time, and I wholeheartedly welcome it.